Okay, so week 4, and it's a little weird for me because I'm in actually week 2 and projecting out to week 4. And I haven't actually seen your first Learn Together code that I'm going to see officially for due dates tonight. I'll look at it a little bit today and finish it up tomorrow. So, but it's good. And here's what I appreciate about the students who have gone so far is that you're actually, a group of you are working ahead enough that it's helpful to see. And that's why I like supplying that content. So it is a little weird though. All right, so because this week was all about objects, and it's interesting when I look at the sequence of concepts that Andrew's covering in his course. Generally, when I've seen JavaScript courses, they actually cover arrays, which we will cover next week, before objects. But in the truth of the matter, it's good to understand both concepts and then actually understand how they will work together. And we will start seeing the two, meaning because you can use objects in arrays, but it's good just to understand objects on their own. So it's fine. It's just interesting to see that. So what I want you to do for this week's work, and I'm going to do like I have done for the last 2 weeks, is I have some code that I will submit as part of the reply and that you will see. Again, the intention is not until after you've written your code. And I'm not specific about how you implement objects. Well, here's how I am specific. I am saying implement into your stimulus code objects. Now, objects can be used in different ways. You can pass objects into functions, okay? You can actually write functions on objects, calling them now methods. You're going to see in some sample code I'll look at for my mileage example. But you can also return objects from functions. So instead of returning values, you can return objects. So, and it's not necessarily that there is a right way. It really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. The one thing about returning an object that I think is a really good idea, and I'm wondering why I didn't do it more, but that's a very common way we see that when you're exchanging or you're asking for data from the web, what you're getting back is a JavaScript object, and it's actually called a JSON object. It's basically an object, but a little different, but it is a very common way that we see data flow between a client and a server. So getting used to that concept is good. So I'm not, and going back to this, I'm not really telling you how to, because there are many different ways, as Andrew showed in his expense tracker, right? I want you to really think about just how would you, based on the code that you've written so far, implement objects, right? And I say to include objects in the processing and the returning of data and implementing at least 2 methods. So within that kind of wide general requirement, think about how you would do it. So in this case, we're creating in our public folder the week 4. I do want you to set up an index file. Now I'm going to definitely, because here's the deal, and I'm going to talk about Dev 0 in a minute. You're going to need to do this for your Dev 0 and getting used to the idea. As you see now, I've covered it for 3 weeks, so you see the importance of doing it. And I'm going to cover it again today in my short example, right? You can use my code for the display on page. Right? And I talked about last week the components of what you have to put in your index file, linking your JS file into your index file. I'll just quickly go over that today. And then once you push that code out to GitHub, is then providing a Git hack link to everyone so that they can look at your code and walk through it. Because learning to walk through code, and in this case with a debugger, DevTools, in our case, is just, I can't harp upon it enough, and you're going to have to do it for Dev 0, okay? Okay, so first on my code. So what I did is I took my mileage program, and let me just make this a little bigger. from last week. And I implemented an object. So here is our object. So opening, closing curly braces. I set up some values within my object. I set up a method, right, to where I had a standalone function setting out on the global space. I now have a method called calculate mileage. I'm passing into it miles in gallons. And then what I'm doing here is I'm calling the this. And if if this is the first time you're seeing the this reference, right, it can be a little bit like, what does this mean? And it just means in this context. See, it's hard to say this without it. It's just within the context of this object. So when it says this display on page, it means this second function. So I have two functions sitting here. One is going to calculate mileage. And the other thing I've done is I've used template strings to output the content. And by the way, all I'm doing here is passing this string into display on page that I covered last week. So what I'm doing here, and you can see a couple things, is that when I determine mileage, I'm actually doing this calculation right in the template string. And I could, if I wanted to store this, actually do it just in a line by itself. And there may be reasons you would do that. Again, you'll have to think about, are you going to use that somewhere in the future? And if I was going to use that, store that somehow in the future, then I would probably set a variable and actually place it on the object. But in this case, I would actually want to do that if I was tracking in an array, which is what we'll learn next week, okay? So what I did here is I divided miles by gallons, the same thing I had done down here when I wrote my function that I've converted into a method. Here, I've also called math.round, because the other really important thing to understand, because we see this all over JavaScript and other programming languages, is that there are built-in objects that we can use, like the math object, right? And understanding the dot notation and how we're referencing within, in this case, the math, there's a method, or what we think of as just a function inside of an object that is going to take whatever the results of miles divided by gallons, and it's going to round it. Okay, so in this case, you also see this same idea of the dot notation to reference my own methods here, my own method, mileage dot calculate mileage. Okay. So in this case, I'm saying, look at the mileage, look within the mileage object for the method called calculate mileage, and then pass, as we've already learned, this idea of arguments, right? And parameters, they become, we're passed in. So there's nothing really new here. What's new is really thinking about and understanding how to set these up, why to do it is, at this point, is kind of like calisthenics. We just want you to get the experience of doing it. To foreshadow a little bit, towards the end of the class, we're going to take what we've built on about understanding objects and methods, and we're going to do something called classes, where we implement a similar concept, but in a more sophisticated and more scalable way than it is done here. Right? So just know that we're not done with this concept of objects and methods or functions. Well, we'll see it again. Okay, so just to complete here, right? So in your app.js, this is actually a different one. Let me just pull up the one I wrote here. And then the index file, right? All I did was do a script tag. I put a div. Right? I could put some more content like I did on my actual code for this week that I'll cover in my reply. Right? But just getting used to this idea. So the last thing I would show you here before we move on is, like, here's my output. I right click, I hit inspect. And when I come in inspect, generally, now this will vary based on your own setup, but this is like your elements over here. And generally what you want to do is go to sources, and you can point to your app.js. And in this case, I would set a breakpoint here, because setting a breakpoint before this would show you how JavaScript sets up the object, but it doesn't actually stop the execution of the page. Well, actually it would if I set it here. And by the way, one of the things you really want to do here, let me go back, is actually play with this, because spending time in here is going to be important. Okay, so understanding how to watch your code run in DevTools is going to be part of what you have to demonstrate for your Dev 0. So in here, once I set a breakpoint, then I refresh the page. It stops the execution. It's going to say, oh, here's my mileage. And by the way, if I scroll over here, it shows it's an object. Shows that in this case, it doesn't actually say it's a method, but it's a function on an object. And then here are the numbers I'm passing into it. So when I hit step, then it actually already passes these things in, and now is getting ready to do the first line of JavaScript within this method. And so now it's going to call, now this, remember, I said this before, this is just referring to this method within this object. I can't just call display on page because it wouldn't understand how to find that function because of the way the objects are referenced. Now that actually leads to the concept of pass by reference, so make sure you got that concept that I think he did a really good job on. Okay, so now I'm going to just run the display on page, and cool, I finished that, so now control is passed back to my next line, so I can see my first line outputted here. Okay, cool. All right, so that's what I want you to do. Let me just come back here. That's what I want you to do for the stimulus, right? Now, again, it's going to be, your code should be a little more involved than what I showed here. I just showed this as an example to kind of, again, talk about these concepts to help you kind of hone in. And as before, I'll do another video for that. Okay, so we're on week 4. There's 3 times in this class that you will write some code based on my requirements, which I'm about to show you, right? You will come in for a code review. As we get I'll probably in attendance for week 4, talk more about this schedule. But what you will do is, the idea is that you write code that accomplishes a specific concept that you've come up with on your own, nothing we've done so far in this class. You bring it into a meeting with me, a Zoom meeting, and I'll have a series of times for you to sign up. And then what the idea is that you're actually, the first thing you'll do is we'll look at your code. I'll have you share your screen on Zoom, and then I'll say, okay, go ahead and run your code. And that's where I'll see if you understand how to set breakpoints, how to walk through your code, how to talk about your code. And that's a really important thing. Is one of the reasons I highly recommend you come see me in my office hours, is so that you can start learning to talk about code, because it's not just another language, but it's also translating it into just conversational level. And that is an important thing. It really allows you to deepen that knowledge, and it's part of what I require. Okay, so it's week 6 that this happened. So I went ahead and brought this up in another tab so you could see this. And this was some of the stuff I've already talked about. You'll do this in your private repo. So these are the requirements, okay? You'll call what I tell you, what I want you to call it, to place your code in there. You will want to create your index file like I've shown before, output something to the browser. So in this case, what I say is write code that reflects what you've learned from the material we've covered so far. And the one thing I would like to say here is that this needs to be a meaningful, like you need to have something that a concept that you're writing code to accomplish, okay? And that's why this week, part of your writing is going to be, I want you to write about that in as much detail as you can. Okay, because that process of writing and thinking about it will help point you to start to write the code, lay out what functions or methods you want to use. So in this case, I say variables that are both block local scope, right, and global scope. I want you to have strings, numbers, booleans, and objects. At least two functions. At least two functions. I mean, I almost don't want to say the number of functions because really, part of this will be determined by how well you've thought and how well you've clarified what you're trying to accomplish. But at least one function that returns a value. And we've seen this several times by now. So if you don't understand, it's a great time to come talk to me. And my display on page function can be totally used, but it's not counted towards one of your functions. And you can also use methods here. You can do a combination if you want. Implement arrays, that's something we do next week, and update them with the methods that we've learned in this class. Again, a little foreshadowing here. Implement loops and produce meaningful output. So part of what we learn when we learn arrays is how to loop through things. I've already talked about this. Display on page, right? Needs to be different than the code we've written so far. Comment your work. And this is the new thing I'm adding this semester, which is for you to walk me through it with DevTools, okay? By the way, if you like Firefox, you can use that as well. So the thing about this, right, is that it's 50% of this class, these 3 code reviews, right? So they're about, I think 16, is that right? 16 points each, 16 percentage points each. So it's a really important thing for, is that right? Yeah, 50%. Somewhere around there. Actually, we can do it. Let's just do the calculation now that so let's take 3, right? Yeah, I was right, 16. I don't know why I thought it was different. So these have a meaningful impact on your grade, and it's really because I do half the points for this class comes from these code reviews. You can see the importance I place on them. So giving it the time it needs is important. Bringing me code that doesn't work will discount that, but part of what I'm looking for is also your understanding. I'm assessing your understanding, how well you got these concepts. So this is why, one of the things I say here, right, is that, bringing me code that doesn't work can definitely affect your points possible, but it also depends on the level. That's why it's hard for me to set a firm, right, it doesn't. But here's what I would say, and hopefully nobody runs into this. I think I've only had this once, is submitting code where you don't do a code review, it only gets you 50% of the points possible anyway, okay? Now, you'll hear me start talking about this in a bit, in the very soon coming weeks. But this is also the idea of coming early into a code review, because if you come before the due date, let's look at when the due date is for this. It's down here, right? So it's February 18th. So I will have code reviews starting the week of the 18th, and then you'll turn it in it's due that night. You want to do it because if it's submitted afterwards, it's subject to late points, which, it's better than no points. And then you'll have the following week, though, once you've submitted it on that due date, to actually do a code review. And I have to do that, honestly, because of the amount of students. I would prefer you all come see me very close to that. But, so just know that you'll hear more about this. What was my point here? I do, and I'll talk about this, I do have a coding style guide, and this is some of the stuff I've already covered related to the way you write functions, the way you define variables, right? So just know that that's coming in. I have some sample code that I did for last semester. Like I told you before, I'm going to be writing some new code for this semester. So going back here, now that I've just covered the basic outline, right? What I want you to do is in your reply, so you'll have the first part where you've implemented objects, making sure you're outputting something to the page, providing a Git hack link so that we can all look at your actual code for the implementing objects. And on the second part, I want you to do some writing. I want you to think about what you're going to create for your Dev 0 and as much detail as you can. Sorry, at this point, write about, because again, don't waste this opportunity to actually drill down and think about it. How I'm going to grade this second one is how much detail did you consider, or how much were you able to come up with that you're going to want your code to accomplish. So anyway, hope that helps. Hope that helps clarify it. I've had most students tell me they enjoyed the code reviews. I know they can be stressful. I totally get that. In this industry, though, it is a very common practice that you will have somebody looking at your code and asking you questions about it. So my goal with these code reviews is to start to give you that experience, because if you continue with this discipline, it is just a good way to get used to it here that is a little more gentle than when you're out there in the professional world. I think I'll shut up for today. Hope that helps you. Week 4 coming at you. Have a good one. Bye.